In last week's episode, we discussed coding agents and enterprise agents, and we started to talk about agentic process automation. And so we decided to dedicate this episode to digging in a lot deeper. I'm John Miller,
My name is Eric Broda.
and this is the Agentic Mesh Podcast. So, Eric, do you want to start to frame what we're going to talk about this week?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me give a little bit of backdrop, and we said a little bit of this in the last session, but
Yep.
every modern enterprise uses workflow tools to fill the gap between the SaaS platforms that they have. Maybe ServiceNow, maybe you have Workday, maybe you have Salesforce. The gap in between today is filled with brittleness. We have edge cases that can't be handled, and we have an inability to deal with ambiguity. The problem is the current tools that people use, robotic process automation, or RPA as it's known, or business process automation, BPA, these tools don't work well. They leave a white space to be filled between the SaaS platforms. And here's the reason this is so important. This white space between the SaaS platforms can be addressed in a more fulsome and much more effective way. And that's where agentic process automation comes in. Our proposition is that instead of RPA or BPA, agents become first-class citizens in the enterprise business process. And we think that's a huge opportunity for every enterprise out there today.
Now, okay, this reminds me, I was doing a project for a state government close by. And one of the challenges we had was connecting AWS Connect, the call center system, and Salesforce. And this was an example of that brittleness in between the two systems. So, a lot of good cloud architects, a lot of Salesforce architects, AWS people on the project. And the conclusion was let's not use a third party tool. Let's not use MuleSoft or any of those things. Let's actually create some Lambda functions in AWS and try to stitch together some calls using the APIs between Salesforce and pass information back and forth between the systems. That was the world's most brittle system. It was rife with problems because when you describe a call in the AWS system, and no disrespect to their great call center system, and you talked about a call in the customer service system, it wasn't the same thing. And so I remember being the data guy on that project saying, what's the definition of a call? And what we started to learn is that depending on who you spoke to, you would get a different definition of a call. Is it that first segment of the call where the human agent answers the phone, or is it the virtual agent that answers and directs you to the human agent? And so when we started to try to trace together all of the steps of what made a call in a modern system across departments in a government agency, we started to realize that the definitions of something as simple as a call were not common between Salesforce and the Connect system, and the glue code was a nightmare. And glue code is typically very brittle. And so I want you to convince me and us that we've got a better way of thinking about it because we're going to use agents to support workflow and process steps that go between systems. Because right now it's a function of your architect who knows which system better or which becomes the main system and which becomes the secondary system of how you define things. And so the more I think about it, the more I really want to talk about what we could have done had we looked at that problem differently in addressing that white space between two systems, because it only became more complicated when somebody said, well, there's a third system, John. Every one of those agents that answers a phone, the human beings that are in the call centers, they rotate and they get trained, and then they're specialized in specific skills that they're good at. And every one of those people should be in the Workday system or their human capital management system, their HR system. And when we started to talk to the call center guys, well, they were like, hey, shouldn't we get it out of the HR system? Well, no, they just pulled together a list of agents. Well, wait, is that the same list of agents that's in the Salesforce system? Of course not. And so I don't want to make this a podcast about all of the complexity of data integration, but seriously, solving the problem of how to think about things in a common way in between three systems is always fun and complicated. And when we think about agentic process automation, I think we need to acknowledge that knowledge engineering and knowledge management and data engineering have to come together to solve some of those problems.
Yeah, absolutely. This sounds like a story from a few of my past clients too. Here's what people are trying to do, and I think
Yeah.
it is a noble aspiration. And what they're trying to do is codify or formalize the business processes that run a company.
Yeah.
And if you and presumably if you can formalize them, you can make them more effective and more efficient. That is exactly the plan, and it is exactly the right thing to do. They're confronted though by a few things. One is complexity.
Yeah.
There's a challenge around the brittleness and the edge cases and dealing with ambiguity. That's a challenge. But here's the model that I think works. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but today we populate these business processes with people. So the question really is our proposition, first off, is that an agent, that's a microservice or some software entity that it has a brain, an LLM, is embodied with some semblance of intelligence. And today, one would say that they're probably at the intern level. Tomorrow may be better. But effectively, what we should be doing is using this intelligence the same way people do. So how do people deal with ambiguity? Well, they use their brain, they fill in the gaps where appropriate, they look at the form and they say, maybe it's missing some data. I know enough about that data. Maybe I can fill some of it in because I know the customer or whatever, or maybe I know enough to reach out to them. So the complexity and the edge cases is something that people deal with very, very well. So if our
Yes.
proposition is that people are like agents. Agents are approaching the capability of junior level people. Maybe we ought to be using some of that capability instead of RPA or BPA, some of the, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but the dumber tools or the more static tools that are out there today. So the proposition is this is we know LLMs deal with ambiguity very well. They talk natural language to people. That's dealing with ambiguity. We know they can answer questions, and sometimes they make things up perhaps, and that's a challenge we can talk about another day, but they're able to deal with edge cases, and that brittleness starts to fade away when we start to use the intelligence and the LLMs that are in the agents. That's the opportunity we have to fill the white space between the SaaS platforms, filling them with agents that work together to address business processes.
Okay. And I really want to make an important clarification here. And I know we've talked about this a lot, so I know your point of view. We are not talking about agents replacing people. What we're actually talking about is that the people that work at the call center know how to handle ambiguity, and that's what they're great at. And that's why, the virtual agents you sometimes get at a call center aren't perfect, but maybe the virtual agents will get better. But what we're talking about is the call center folks and the service team that's creating service tickets in Salesforce. These two systems were designed by different companies that never consulted each other. Why would they? They're separate companies. And so trying to glue together three different systems, SaaS systems, is hard. It's complex. And what we're saying is just like the virtual agents will assist the call center reps taking care of the basic calls. Let's get the agents working in between those systems so that the data movement and the process that happens between, in that white space between systems. And there's a lot of it. And one of the things we found is that it's quite complicated to explain. I would say if you can explain it in plain English, the architects could build it. And you know what? It was very hard to get it in plain English. But now, if we can express a business process in plain English and this or any other language, the large language models can actually understand if we can give them the right context and the right policies. So you're bringing back almost a war story that I'm getting a little bit of shocks, back from some of the hard problems because it was very frustrating trying to say, well, we all know what we want to do. We want to serve the constituents of the state. And we all want to do better because it's really important that government functions. But if you have vendors with disparate systems all silos, then how do you bridge those silos in the white space? And that's the promise of agentic process automation. But there's a lot we have to do to make sure that that actually can work. And I think that's part of what we want to cover today, right? Or part of what we are covering today. Do you want to break in and say a few
Yeah.
things?
Well, I think you're highlighting the key point is this is not a focus on the future of work, and there's a great debate and discussion to be had on that. What this is about is using tools, large language models inside agents to address the complexity and ambiguity that is a natural consequence of business processes in large organizations. So the real question now to answer to flow into the next part of the topic is how do I deal with this complexity and ambiguity?
Yeah.
And there's three key things that I think are crucial that enable agentic process automation. You named one of them, and I think I'd like to start with that and get your feedback on. That's knowledge engineering. It's the ability to capture a corpus, understand not just the concepts, but the policies, the decisions that embody how a business actually runs, capturing that in a repository that's queryable, and then actually being able to query that knowledge base and create context information for the agent so they can actually work better, smarter, and faster. So John, you're an expert in data management, data governance, knowledge engineering. Tell me kind of where you see this going.
Well, I will gladly accept credit for being a good data engineer and a good data architect. Knowledge engineering and management is something my sister is the expert in. She has an advanced degree in library sciences, so I'm not going to pretend I am equal to her in that regard. So, having said that, one of the challenges we had was getting the definition of common things that we're going to that need to persist. Like this idea of a call. And if somebody asked for a callback, well, actually, how do we handle a callback? Well, we wanted to create a case file and we wanted to put that case in Salesforce. So these nouns that I'm describing, case, call, callback, what was funny is how confusing it can sound when you hear technical people trying to repeat back to the business people what they heard. And so this has always been a problem in technology, and it's going to continue to be a challenge. But what has changed is that now we can express in plain English what these concepts are. And instead of putting them in the spreadsheet, because that's what we all ended up doing, we put them in a catalog, but nobody used that. But in the spreadsheet that had the definitions, I even put them in the database, but nobody would look. Nobody decided. But the thing is, what we need to do is allow the business to test their rules by writing it into an agent or a chat interface and saying, if I apply this rule, will I get the data result that I expect? And so that thing that I just described is somehow bringing together structured data, the call, there's a bunch of call detail records or call trace records. There's a bunch of transcripts. Well, transcripts are unstructured data. So if you really want to solve the problem, you've got to treat the structured and the unstructured data and link them together so that you can answer intelligent questions. Now, you could in the contact center system, but if you asked a question about a case and it was in the Salesforce system, bro, no chance. So for agentic process automation to work, we're going to need to solve this knowledge management and data management challenge and bring these together so that we call it the corpus or the knowledge base, so whatever term people feel good about, that information is available in the context window that we've been talking about that agents need to have. And we've also said that context window is short. So we have to be very sensitive of what's a minimum viable context. And we talked about that earlier. But I'll stop talking about my favorite topic, but this knowledge management, data management coming together is the first thing that we need to recognize as an issue, and we need to solve that as a first-class problem to make process automation possible.
Absolutely. I would argue, John, to your point, that this knowledge engineering is directly applicable to APA, agentic process automation. Even without that focus on APA, it is useful to the data engineer, the people building projects. So this has a inherent good and value to the enterprise. But I want to talk a little bit about why, what are some of the challenges in doing this? And maybe this
Yep.
is why people aren't doing it more often than we think. So this corpus is literally by definition anything in the enterprise, structured, unstructured, and tacit. Stuff that is not written down, not in a database, but is locked in some of the experts' heads. So sometimes this takes the form of overrides. I'm allowed to do this when there's these
Yeah.
combination of things, or if then else, or how do I escalate something to somebody, and when to know to do that. Those are the decisions that in the policies that actually run the enterprise. So there's a whole bunch of different sources of this information, and it's dispersed everywhere.
Yeah.
So I don't want to trivialize, we call it the corpus and capturing that information. I don't want to trivialize how difficult that is. But here's what I would say. Anytime there's a difficult challenge, it's worth doing if the payoff is there. And we believe strongly that the payoff is there.
Yeah.
So here's how this thing, works is, and I'll simplify dramatically. We can access structured data through database technology. That's a given. We can find a way to access a lot of the information, whether it's in Word documents, Google Drive, spreadsheets, PowerPoints, standard operating procedures, Jira tickets, ServiceNow tickets. There's a way to do that. It's not rocket science. It's just work that you have to do. What we found in our engagements, though, is one of the things that are supremely useful is actually going out there and two things: interviewing the experts and capturing that,
Yes.
transcribing it. But here's the thing that I think most people, especially in IT, might be missing is I remember when I was, building big systems back in the day, and we would do, the waterfall approach, maybe a little bit of agile, but what we ended up doing is we'd be talking to these experts and we'd be writing this stuff down in, whatever technology we had of the day. And then once we built the system, that kind of went away. And
Yeah.
it never got updated, never saw the light of day. Here's the thing is we spent all that time capturing requirements and design criteria. We should be capturing that. That is part of the corpus that is not necessarily persisted. It may be
Yeah.
transient. It should not be transient. It is one of those wealths of information that if we actually made it queryable, that is a core piece of how not only the business runs, but how the applications run. So literally there's low-hanging fruit laying on the ground that we're not picking up today that would be fundamental to the corpus and the opportunity ahead of us.
Yes, and I think that is the most important thing we can do on this podcast is start to think about and share how, people or organizations that are listening and thinking about how can I use AI and agentic AI to improve my knowledge base? What's funny about that state project is that we're even working with their knowledge management system. And what was hilarious is the knowledge management system had the policies and procedures, but it was never even considered a first class source for any of this information. Now, because it was a government agency, we also weren't allowed to record the interviews. So we were really hamstrung in building complex IT systems in a brownfield environment, in an environment where you have a lot of legacy systems. But I think if we're going to have breakthroughs, then we're going to need to let go of a vendor only approach to thinking about that critical knowledge about that agency or that department and how that it gets managed and is treated as sort of first class. It's kind of the it's the kind of like the data warehouse, the data lake, the lake house, but the knowledge lake house or whatever it's called. We really have to treat that as something that we can get to beyond just the structured data.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Now, I want to combine this concept, knowledge engineering, with something that we talked in the last episode, coding agents. So we can see if you've ever used Codex or Claude Code, you know that this is something that supercharges the developer experience. It gives the average developer, it gives them a superpower to actually create brand new sets of code in brand new and innovative ways. Here's the thing is it does that when it has access to a repository, and it combines that with the knowledge that is out there in the internet. It can access through tools, the internet, and the stuff that's embedded in its training. Here's the thing it doesn't have. It doesn't have that knowledge, that corpus that
yeah.
we just talked about. So imagine if I could actually combine Claude Code or Codex with a queryable knowledge repository, a knowledge graph of the enterprise's knowledge.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking, we can set up techniques, RAG, and all those things to access SQL databases and such. But if we actually corralled the corpus of that knowledge, the tacit knowledge, this dispersed stuff, and made that accessible to the modern coding tools, we could do a lot of really great things, John.
Yeah, I hear you, man. But as we joked about a year ago, most people don't know what a taxonomy is, or,
True.
it's like, dude, listen, it's just the way we're going to classify things hierarchically, if nothing else. Just think of it that like that, a directory structure. How would you organize stuff? So I think in order to be very successful, that's why it's the year of knowledge engineering, getting involved with context engineering and maybe getting the word engineering out of it to bring in the
Yeah.
librarians. But anyway, but we did want to talk about a couple other things, didn't we, about APA?
Yeah, all this stuff about taxonomies and corpuses, you're much more knowledgeable than I. So I'll talk about something that I do know quite well. The
Yeah.
two other things I'll mention them briefly, then we'll dive into them. I'm sure if we're going to have agents in real business processes doing real things, they need to be enterprise grade. What does that mean? I'll
Yeah.
make it really, really simple. They ought to be held to the same account that any other enterprise application is held to. They need to have, security. They need to have identity and naming. They need to have a stable, reliable communications fabric. They need to be able to collaborate in a consistent, coherent fashion. These are all things that are table stakes in any enterprise application. They apply to enterprise grade agents. The second thing I would say is if you're going to have a lot of these agents, it's not necessarily just about building and putting those capabilities in. It's actually being able to manage fleets or swarms of agents of tens, hundreds, thousands. That is a distributed computing problem that you need to think through. But nevertheless, that is the scope of enterprise grade capability that is required to actually fulfill APA. And the last one related to this is there's a wealth of standards that are out there, but the two that I would say are first and foremost that anybody considering APA, agentic process automation, ought to be thinking about is A2A, so agent to agent protocol. And the next one is arguably even much more popular is MCP from Anthropic, now in the Linux Foundation. These are things that every architect and every software engineer, every process engineer needs to start to become quite comfortable with, John.
Yeah. Okay. So I was at a meetup last night where we were talking about Model Context Protocol, or MCP. And somebody made the observation that MCP was designed for one big agent controlling a bunch of baby agents. And they even used the term host, client, and server. So, oy vey, somebody in the audience said, "Are we going back to the 90s client server? What comes next? Distributed computing? Ergo A to A." So, what is funny about what's happening in the AI agent space is that we're covering the old ground again. We're applying it to new scenarios, and it's going to be fun because a lot of people have expertise in those old systems and how we went from client server to distributed. And I think the protocols are going through that right now. And so we're not there yet. And I think the thing that really got everybody stuck last night was in the protocols when we were discussing, well, how do you implement role-based access control? Right? It's largely solved for structured data. It was a Snowflake event. So yes, they've got great stories and it's very robust. But once you start to carve up the context and think about that, unless you have an access control mechanism, how do you prevent an agent who's playing the role of an analyst from seeing something they're not allowed to see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, here's the thing: we were talking to some folks earlier. You and I were talking to some folks earlier today, and the fundamental concept around identity this is again, if you're talking about enterprise grade agents or the ecosystem, you have to talk about identity. That's the
Yep.
foundation for security. Identity's close cousin is naming conventions and such. But here's what happens when you get an identity. What you get is you can now apply roles, or using things like OAuth 2. So you can begin to apply roles, which then confer permissions and capability like that. So the foundation around this stuff is stuff that we talked about 20 years ago, John. What goes around comes around. I'd like to say it this way: we are going to be standing on the shoulders of giants who figured out all this distributed computing stuff, figured out all the identity protocols, all the OAuth 2 and such. The beautiful thing about this is, and this is why I'm so jazzed about it, is the fact of the matter is it's stuff that you and I've been doing for 20 years. I live and breathe distributed computing, identity, communication fabric, discovery, all that stuff. But here's the thing: I'm learning from the experts. And here's the thing: you, the listener, you also have the opportunity to learn from the experts. There's decades of practice around some of these enterprise grade capabilities. And you know what? The skills actually exist inside the enterprises today to a large degree. That doesn't suggest, though, that there's nothing to learn. Newer
Right.
protocols, A to A and MCP, these things are incredible. They're just foretelling what can be done, and they're
Right.
maturing. But make no mistake, they will be part and parcel of the agentic process automation that we see in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And just in case you don't know, MCP's been alive for just over a year, and A2A, not even a year. So the race to get ahead and create structure around communication protocols and a lot more is emerging. And so stay tuned. We're gonna we're gonna follow it all as it develops and as it becomes easier, or it becomes easier to think about how you can actually build trustworthy, governed systems that are transparent and observable. Anything else we want to cover before we wrap? We've been talking quite a while.
John, I think that's a wrap, my friend.
Okay, let's declare victory. Until next time, thank you for listening. Cheers.